They never officially declared war. No marching armies across borders. No single day you can point to and say, that's when it started. Yet for nearly half a century, the entire planet lived with a gun to its head. One mistake, one misunderstanding, one man pressing one button, and everything, cities, history, humanity, gone in minutes. This wasn't a war fought with bullets. It was fought with secrets, fear, ideology, and weapons so powerful they were never meant to be used. This was the Cold War. But to understand how the world reached the edge of nuclear extinction, we have to rewind to the moment everyone thought peace had finally arrived. 1945. World War II ends. Germany surrenders. The streets of London, New York, Paris, and Moscow explode into celebration. Strangers hug. Soldiers cry. Humanity exhales. For a brief moment, it feels like the nightmare is over. But behind the smiles and victory parades, something far more dangerous is quietly taking shape. Because the alliance that defeated Hitler was never built on trust. It was built on necessity. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't friends. They were partners against a common enemy. And once that enemy disappeared, so did the partnership. On one side stood the United States, young, industrially untouched by war, economically dominant, and in possession of a weapon so destructive it had just erased 2 cities from existence. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, victorious but shattered. Entire regions burned to the ground, an estimated 27 million Soviets dead. That kind of loss doesn't just scar a nation, it rewires how you see the world. From Moscow's perspective, an invasion wasn't a hypothetical fear. It was history repeating itself. Napoleon, then Hitler. Both came from the West. So the Soviet mindset was simple. Never let it happen again. But here's where everything starts to fracture. Because the 2 superpowers didn't just disagree on borders or influence. They believed in completely different realities. America believed in capitalism, private property, free markets, individual freedom, democracy. The Soviet Union believed in communism, state-controlled economy, collective ownership, one-party rule, and dissent. Let's just say it wasn't exactly encouraged. Each side looked at the other and didn't just see a rival. They saw an existential threat. And when 2 nations both believe the other one could destroy their way of life, paranoia becomes policy. That paranoia had names and faces at the top. As in the Soviet Union, power rested with Joseph Stalin, a man so suspicious he purged his own generals, so ruthless he sent millions to die in labor camps, so obsessed with control that fear became the glue holding the system together. To Stalin, the West was not to be trusted. Peace was temporary. Conflict was inevitable. So if protecting the Soviet Union meant installing loyal governments across Eastern Europe, crushing opposition, and silencing resistance, then that was a price he was willing to pay. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America had a new leader. Franklin Roosevelt was gone. And suddenly, the presidency landed on Harry Truman's desk. He had been in office for barely 2 weeks when someone pulled him aside and said, "By the way, we built the most powerful weapon in human history. No pressure." Truman now faced a nightmare scenario. He had to manage a volatile alliance, decide what to do with nuclear weapons, and deal with a dictator who trusted no one. And things only got worse. Because while the world was still rebuilding from war, Europe lay in ruins. Governments had collapsed. Economies were broken. Power vacuums were everywhere. And the Soviet Union moved fast. One by one, Eastern European countries fell under communist control. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Officially, these were liberations. In reality, the Red Army stood nearby while elections took place. The secret police handled the rest. Opposition leaders vanished. Resistance movements were crushed. And an invisible line began forming across Europe. The West watched in growing alarm, because from Washington's point of view, this didn't look like defense. It looked like expansion. That fear gave gave birth to a new American strategy: containment. The idea wasn't to roll back communism, but to stop it from spreading any further. And nowhere did that strategy face a bigger test than in one shattered country at the center of everything: Germany. After the war, Germany was carved into pieces. The western zones controlled by the US, Britain, and France. The eastern zone controlled by the Soviets. Seems simple enough, until you realize that Berlin, the former Nazi capital, sat deep inside Soviet territory, and Berlin itself was divided. West Berlin became a tiny island of democracy, surrounded by a sea of communism. And Stalin absolutely hated it. So in 1948, he made his move. Every road, every railway, every supply route into West Berlin was cut off. Our 2 million civilians were suddenly trapped. No food, no fuel, no medicine. Stalin believed the West would blink, abandon the city, or force their way in, giving him an excuse to respond. But instead, the West chose an option no one expected. They took to the sky. Day and night, American and British planes flew non-stop, dropping food, coal, medicine, even candy for children. It was called the Berlin Airlift, and while it saved a city, it also sent a message. This conflict wasn't going away. And just as that realization sank in, the balance of power shifted forever. Because in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The nuclear monopoly was over, and the world had just entered its most dangerous chapter yet. The moment the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, and the Cold War stopped being a political rivalry and became a countdown. Now both sides had the power to erase cities, then continents, then civilization itself. So instead of pulling the trigger, they started playing a far more dangerous game: deterrence. By the 1950s, nuclear weapons had evolved into something almost unthinkable: hydrogen bombs. Thousands of times stronger than Hiroshima. Soon, both superpowers stockpiled enough warheads to destroy the planet several times over, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why build more world-ending weapons when one is already enough? The answer was fear. This logic became official policy under a doctrine with a brutally honest name: Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD. If one side launched nukes, the other would retaliate. Everyone would die. No winners, no second chances. And strangely, that insanity worked. Because when the cost of war is extinction, restraint becomes survival. But restraint didn't mean peace. Instead, the Cold War spilled into proxy wars across the globe. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Superpowers avoided fighting each other directly, but millions of ordinary people paid the price. Then came walls. In 1961, East Germany sealed its border overnight. Concrete, barbed wire, guard towers. The Berlin Wall didn't just divide a city. It became a symbol of a world split in two. People weren't kept out. They were kept in. At least 140 people died trying to escape. Not because they were criminals, but because they wanted choice. And yet, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War didn't happen at a wall. It happened underwater. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a Soviet submarine was surrounded by American ships. Depth charges exploded nearby. The crew believed war had already begun. Inside that submarine was a nuclear torpedo. 2 officers agreed to launch it. Only one man said no. Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the strike. He insisted they surface. He insisted they verify. That single decision may have saved the world. Because had that torpedo been fired, retaliation would have been immediate. Cities would have burned. History would have ended differently. After that crisis, something changed. Leaders realized how close they'd come, not because of strategy, but because of misunderstanding. Hotlines were installed. Arms treaties were signed. Tensions cooled, but never vanished. Then the system itself began began to crack. The Soviet economy stagnated. Afghanistan drained resources. And Eastern Europe demanded freedom. And when Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, he made a choice no Soviet leader before him had made. He didn't send in the tanks. One by one, communist governments collapsed. Borders opened. And in 1989, people climbed onto the Berlin Wall, not to escape, but to tear it down. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. No final battle, no nuclear exchange, no apocalyptic ending. The Cold War ended not with explosions, but with exhaustion. And that might be its greatest lesson. For 45 years, humanity lived under the shadow of total annihilation. Not because anyone wanted to end the world, but because fear, secrecy, and ideology pushed it closer than reason ever should have allowed. The Cold War proved something unsettling, that the most dangerous wars aren't always the loudest, and sometimes it's the fate of the world rests not on leaders or weapons, but on one exhausted human being choosing not to press a button. And that decision changed everything.